In November 1984, inside a corporate boardroom in Chicago, Illinois, the company that had mechanized the American prairie announced it was surrendering. For approximately $430 million in cash and stock, the agricultural equipment division of International Harvester was sold to Tenneco, the corporate parent of a bitter rival, J.Y. Case. Overnight, a sprawling network of factories, parts depots, and thousands of red tractors sitting on dealership lots from Ohio to California suddenly belonged to a competitor. The legendary Farmall plant in Rock Island, Illinois, a massive industrial cathedral that had forged millions of machines for American fields, was marked for closure. Just a decade earlier, that same brand had commanded absolute loyalty across the American Corn Belt. International Harvester was not merely a manufacturing firm, it was a Midwestern institution. In 1974, an agricultural equipment dealer with the iconic IH logo above his door held the keys to generational wealth. The company had invented the row crop tractor. They had painted rural America red. They possessed a dealer network so dense and so deeply ingrained in county commerce and farm financing that their dominance seemed permanent. They were too large, too entrenched, and too essential to fail. But the real story of International Harvester is not the corporate paperwork signed in the fall of 1984. It is the story of how an invincible American empire was brought to its knees by the very forces it helped create. It is a story of catastrophic labor strikes, staggering corporate debt, a collapsing farm economy, and the brutal reality that in the American agricultural market, a century of mechanical brilliance cannot save an organization that loses control of its own scale. Every week, we tell the stories of the machines that built the American field and the economic forces that ultimately tore their builders apart. Like the video, and subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not in the corporate boardrooms of the 1980s, but at the dawn of the American century, in Chicago, Illinois, in 1902. In 1902, the foundation of the American agricultural century was laid in a boardroom in Chicago, Illinois. Financier J.P. Morgan orchestrated the merger of the McCormick Harvesting Machine Company, the Deering Harvester Company, and three smaller regional agricultural firms. The resulting monolith was named International Harvester. The company inherited the engineering legacy of Cyrus McCormick, whose mechanical reaper had already fundamentally changed the speed of the American grain harvest. By the early 1910s, International Harvester possessed steel foundries, vast timberlands, coal mines, and the most extensive agricultural sales force on the planet. They were an industrial titan of the highest order, but despite their immense capital, their engineering divisions had not yet solved the most stubborn, fundamental problem of the American farm. Before the mid-1920s, American agriculture was still largely powered by muscle, oats, and blood. Steam tractors and early gasoline tractors existed on the plains, but they were massive, lumbering beasts built entirely for straight-line draft power. They were highly effective at pulling heavy plows through the unbroken prairie soils of the Dakotas or the vast wheat fields of Kansas. But they were functionally useless in the cornfields of Iowa, the cotton rows of Mississippi, or the mixed crop family farms of Indiana. A tractor that weighed 4 tons, utilized massive steel wheels, and steered like a locomotive could not navigate between planted rows of growing crops to clear weeds. Because early tractors could not accomplish this critical summer task, farmers had no choice. They still had to feed, house, harness, and maintain teams of draft horses specifically for cultivating. Cultivator, an implement that works the soil between crop rows to control weeds and aerate the ground. If a farmer could not replace his horses for summer cultivation, he could not justify the monumental expense of buying a tractor merely for spring plowing. The mechanization of the American row crop farm had completely stalled. American farmers required a single machine that could do it all. They needed to plow the earth in the spring, cultivate the rows in the summer, and run the belt pulley for the thresher in the fall. Inside International Harvester's massive tractor works facility in Chicago, a senior engineer named Bert R. Benjamin understood this agonizing market gap. Benjamin, who had grown up working on an Iowa farm, spent the early 1920s developing an experimental, lightweight, general-purpose tractor. He envisioned a revolutionary machine. It required high ground clearance to pass safely over tall, growing plants without snapping the stalks. It required closely spaced front wheels that could easily navigate the narrow dirt paths between planted rows. Row crop tractor, a tractor designed to work between planted rows, using adjustable wheel spacing and exceptional operator visibility so the farmer can cultivate crops without destroying them. In 1924, International Harvester released a limited run of 200 pre-production units for rigorous field testing. Rather than testing them in the Corn Belt, they sent them primarily to the cotton farms of Texas. The long rows, heavy weed pressure, and intense summer heat of the Texas cotton country demanded a ruthless, reliable cultivating solution. If the machine survived Texas, it could survive anywhere. They named this strange tricycle-shaped machine the Farmall, a deliberate promise that it was designed to farm all the crops and render the draft horse obsolete. The American entry of the Farmall changed the landscape of rural commerce permanently. By 1925, the machine, which would later be known as the Farmall Regular, entered mass commercial production. The starting purchase price was roughly $825 in 1925, approximately $14,000 in today's money. At that price point, a Midwestern farmer was not merely buying an engine mounted on steel wheels. He was buying the economic justification to finally sell off his expensive, labor-intensive horse teams. The broader agricultural industry took immediate notice of the paradigm shift. In 1925, Farm Implement News, the leading trade publication of the era, extensively reviewed the tricycle-style design and recognized that Harvester had unlocked the future of farming. The numbers validated the engineering. By 1930, production records indicate that International Harvester was manufacturing over 30,000 Farmall tractors a year. The machines flowed constantly out of the Chicago tractor works, loaded onto rail cars, and distributed to local dealerships across the Midwest, the Great Plains, and the Deep South. Crucially, when a farmer in Ohio or Illinois bought a Farmall, he was not just buying a prime mover. He was buying into an entire proprietary ecosystem. International Harvester engineered specific cultivators, mowers, and planters designed to bolt directly onto the Farmall frame. Implements, tools pulled or powered by a tractor to perform specific field tasks. By tightly integrating the tractor and the implement, Harvester ensured that the local IH dealer became the absolute center of the farmer's mechanical universe. The dealer, the parts counter, and the service mechanic were all backed by the limitless industrial might of Chicago. The American farmer was finally mechanized, and the fields belonged to International Harvester. To a farmer walking onto an International Harvester dealership lot in the spring of 1926, the new Farmall Regular did not look like a traditional machine of industry. It looked skeletal. It looked awkward. It looked almost insectoid. The dominant tractor of that specific era was the Fordson, a low, heavy cast-iron block that hugged the dirt, pulled exclusively from the rear, and required massive headlands to turn around. The Farmall, by contrast, stood tall and strange. It featured massive rear steel wheels, equipped with aggressive steel spade lugs, designed to bite deeply into soft prairie topsoil. The engine block sat remarkably high above the rear axle. The steering column stretched back over the transmission housing to an operator platform positioned perfectly for unhindered forward visibility. But the most striking physical feature of the machine was the front axle. Instead of a wide conventional track, the two small front steel wheels were pushed tightly together, angling down from a single vertical steering pedestal. This was the famous tricycle configuration, and it mathematically solved the geometry of the American field. Row spacing. The distance between crop rows, it determines how wide a tractor and cultivator can be. Across the American Midwest, corn was traditionally planted in 40-inch rows, a measurement dictated by the width of a draft horse. The Farmall's narrow front wheels threaded perfectly down the center between two planted rows, while the tall rear wheels straddled them. With nearly 30 inches of vertical clearance under the rear differential, the machine could pass safely over tall, growing corn stalks without snapping them in half. At $825 in 1925, roughly $14,000 in today's money, the Farmall Regular was more than twice the price of a standard Fordson tractor. To an outside observer or a banker looking at a ledger, this pricing seemed deeply uncompetitive. But International Harvester understood the ground-level economics of the American farm better than automotive engineers. Maintaining a team of 5 draft horses required dedicating roughly 20% of a family farm's total acreage just to grow oats and hay for feed. The horses had to be fed through the dead of winter. They had to be rested in the punishing heat of the summer. The Farmall did not consume fuel when it was turned off. For a Midwestern family operation, the purchase of a Farmall eliminated the draft horse entirely. The crop yield from the reclaimed feed acreage, combined with the sheer speed of mechanical cultivation, could equal the margin from an entire harvest. The true American moat of the Farmall, however, was not simply the tricycle layout. It was the proprietary mounting architecture. The cast iron frame of the tractor was drilled with specific, heavy-duty attachment bosses. The tractor did not just pull implements behind it on a drawbar, cultivator, an implement that works the soil between crop rows to control weeds and aerate the ground. International Harvester engineered their own line of McCormick Deering cultivators, mowers, and planters that bolted directly onto the Farmall frame. Sitting high on the steel seat, the operator could look down past the narrow hood and watch the front-mounted cultivator shovels slice through the dirt just inches from the delicate crop. A slight turn of the steering wheel moved the front tires and the cultivator gang simultaneously. This surgical precision in the dirt could not be replicated by any standard pulling tractor. Furthermore, the Farmall integrated a revolutionary power delivery system, PTO, or power takeoff, a rotating shaft that transfers engine power from the tractor to an implement such as a mower, baler, auger, or manure spreader. The Farmall did not just pull weight, it powered external machinery. Because the implements were proprietary, the farmer became completely locked into the International Harvester ecosystem. When a farmer bought a Farmall, he committed to buying McCormick Deering implements for the rest of his life, and he committed to buying his replacement parts exclusively from the local harvester dealer. Competitors could not replicate this web of loyalty, service, and patented attachments overnight. The name on the builder's plate was not a country of origin. It was a specification. The distribution breakthrough that forced the entire country to accept this new standard occurred when the machine submitted to absolute objective measurement. In September 1925, the Farmall arrived at the testing grounds in Lincoln. The Nebraska Tractor Test Laboratory, the testing authority that turned horsepower claims into published numbers. A tractor that failed the test lost more than a specification. It lost trust. Under test number 117, the Farmall Regular officially delivered over 13 drawbar horsepower and 20 belt horsepower. Drawbar pull. The pulling force a tractor can deliver to an implement through the drawbar. With those verified numbers, the American professional agricultural ecosystem rapidly adopted the machine. The Nebraska test gave it empirical credibility. The Iowa State College Agricultural Extension Service utilized its tricycle concepts in their mechanization field demonstrations. The Illinois Agricultural Association heavily promoted general-purpose tractor farming to its members. Successful Farming magazine began featuring the row crop shift in its highly influential pages. Regional Farm Bureau federations recommended the platform for replacing animal labor. The dense network of Illinois and Indiana IH dealers aggressively hauled demonstration units directly into farmers' fields, proving the cultivator's worth in local dirt. The market response was absolute. By 1932, industry records indicate that International Harvester had manufactured and sold over 100,000 Farmall tractors. The sheer volume of red and gray steel flowing into the American countryside forced a total industry capitulation. Heavyweight domestic manufacturers like John Deere, J.I. Case, Alice Chalmers, and Oliver were forced to completely abandon their traditional designs and scramble to engineer their own tricycle row crop machines. The Farmall had not just captured a market segment, it had dictated the shape of the American tractor for the next 40 years. By 1936, International Harvester made a psychological decision that forever altered the visual landscape of the United States. They stopped painting their tractors battleship gray. They painted them a deep, vibrant, unmistakable shade known as Harvester Red. But the true cultural and mechanical peak of the empire arrived 3 years later, in the summer of 1939, when the company replaced the aging regular and F-Series with a completely new generation of machines. This was the introduction of the legendary Letter Series, specifically the medium-duty Farmall H and the heavy-duty Farmall M. The American agricultural economy of the late 1930s was rapidly shifting. As the Great Depression faded and the specter of global war began drawing young men away from rural counties and into urban defense plants, farm labor became desperately scarce. American farmers no longer just wanted a machine to replace a horse. They needed high-speed, high-horsepower machines that could allow one man to do the work of three. And they needed those machines to be reliable enough to run from before dawn until long after dusk. International Harvester did not merely update their engineering. They hired the renowned industrial designer Raymond Loewy, the man who shaped the look of American locomotives, automobiles, and household appliances, to completely redesign the Farmall. Loewy gave the new tractors a sleek, swept-back, aerodynamic appearance. He integrated a fluted radiator grille. He tapered the hood to give the operator a flawless line of sight down to the front wheels. The styling was modern, the engineering was proven, the dealer support was absolute. When the Farmall H and M rolled out, the American professional agricultural ecosystem embraced them with a fervor bordering on religious loyalty. The Iowa Farm Bureau promoted their unparalleled efficiency for massive corn operations. Wisconsin dairies relied on the Farmall H for daily manure hauling, feed grinding, and heavy chores. Mississippi Delta cotton cooperatives purchased fleets of the taller models for wide-acre cultivation. The Ohio dealer network aggressively pushed them into mixed grain and livestock operations. Farm Journal and Successful Farming magazines gave the sleek new designs center stage reverence in their editorial coverage. The Nebraska Tractor Test Laboratory verified their increased output, granting them immediate objective authority. The USDA extension programs actively measured their monumental impact on wartime food production. Down at the county level, local mechanics stocked their wooden bins exclusively with red parts, knowing exactly which machines would be working the local soil. To stand on an International Harvester dealership lot in Illinois in the spring of 1941 was to witness the absolute zenith of American industrial confidence. Under the bright Midwestern sunlight, a row of brand-new Farmall M tractors sat perfectly aligned on the crushed gravel. The flawless red paint gleamed against the bright silver of the exhaust stacks. The heavy cast-iron wheel weights spoke of immense pulling capability. When a farmer stepped up onto the steel operator platform and settled into the seat, he looked out over a long, narrow hood that felt like the prow of a ship. The tractor did not look like a crude farm implement. It looked like the future. It felt like prosperity. The sheer scale of International Harvester's American dominance during this period defies modern comparison. The company possessed a dealer network that penetrated nearly every rural zip code in the country. By the post-war decades, a farmer in the American Midwest was rarely more than 15 miles away from an authorized International Harvester parts counter. If a hydraulic pump failed or a transmission bearing cracked, the replacement part was almost always sitting on a shelf in the same county. If it was not, the massive regional parts depots could put it on a train or a truck and have it in the mechanic's hands by the next morning. This infrastructure was the company's ultimate weapon. A superior tractor built by a competitor was useless if it had to sit idle for a week waiting for a shipping crate to arrive from a distant factory. International Harvester understood that they were not merely selling horsepower. They were selling uptime. They were selling a guarantee. As American farms consolidated and grew larger through the 1950s and 60s, International Harvester scaled alongside them. The tricycle tractors that had replaced horses slowly gave way to massive, heavy-duty row crop machines built for hundreds of acres. The company introduced the muscle tractor era. They brought out the 06 series, the 56 series, and eventually the legendary 66 series, highlighted by the iconic International 1066. The 1066 became the undisputed king of the 1970s American farm. It dominated the Nebraska tractor test records for fuel economy and drawbar pull in its horsepower class. It dominated the local county fair tractor pulls. It dominated the heavy spring tillage across the Great Plains. These machines featured massive diesel engines, climate-controlled cabs, and advanced transmissions. Torque amplifier, a mechanical system that allows an operator to shift down and increase pulling power on the go without interrupting the momentum of the tractor. This technological escalation was not driven by prestige. It was driven by the unforgiving math of the American harvest. On a rapidly cooling November afternoon in Illinois, with a heavy winter storm approaching and 1,000 acres of standing corn vulnerable to the wind, the reliability of a red tractor pulling a heavy grain wagon could mean the difference between securing a family's annual income and losing an entire harvest to the snow. A farmer did not buy an International Harvester tractor merely because of brand loyalty. He bought it because if the machine failed, the local dealer would drive a service truck directly into the mud of the cornfield at 2 a.m. to replace a shattered bearing. The loyalty to the brand was fiercely generational. A grandfather had traded his draft horses for a Farmall regular. His son had plowed through the post-war boom on a Farmall M. The grandson was now sitting inside the air-conditioned cab of an International 1066 farming triple the acreage. This unbroken chain of brand inheritance created a barrier to entry that foreign competitors and domestic rivals found nearly impossible to penetrate. By the mid-1970s, the International Harvester empire had reached a staggering peak. They were not just building tractors, they were manufacturing heavy construction equipment, commercial trucks, industrial gas turbines, and school buses. But agriculture remained their spiritual core. In 1977, the company introduced the axial flow rotary combine, a technological breakthrough that revolutionized grain harvesting. Combine, a massive agricultural machine that cuts, threshes, and cleans grain in a single continuous operation across the field. The axial flow design was smoother, faster, and left more clean grain in the hopper than any conventional machine on the market. The production metrics of the era bordered on the incomprehensible. In 1974, International Harvester produced its 5 millionth tractor. The agricultural equipment division alone was generating over $1 billion in annual revenue, roughly $6 billion today. The dealer network exceeded 3,000 individual, family-owned storefronts across the United States. For a vast portion of the American rural population, buying anything other than a red tractor was considered an act of financial recklessness. They trusted the heavy castings. They trusted the local mechanic. They trusted the red paint. But the sheer size of International Harvester had created a dangerous, unseen vulnerability. To support a dealer network of that magnitude and to manufacture millions of machines across dozens of massive Midwestern plants, the company required a staggering, uninterrupted river of cash. The factories were deeply unionized. The labor costs were immense, and the corporate management structure had become dangerously bloated. The empire had grown so large that it could no longer react quickly to the ground beneath it. The massive parts depots that promised next-day delivery required fortunes to operate. International Harvester had conquered the American field, but they had forgotten how to survive an economic winter. The fatal flaw in the International Harvester empire was not mechanical engineering. It was the sheer, crushing weight of its own manufacturing footprint. By the late 1970s, Force 5, scale, CHG parts, and labor costs began to consume the company from the inside out. Harvester operated dozens of massive aging factories across the Midwest. Their historical labor agreements with the United Auto Workers had granted generous concessions over decades of unbroken prosperity. As a result, the raw cost to manufacture a red tractor in Illinois was significantly higher than the cost for their fiercest domestic competitor to manufacture a green tractor in Iowa. In 1977, corporate leadership brought in Archie McCardle, an executive from outside the agricultural industry, to aggressively cut manufacturing costs and force the company into modern profitability. The financial strategy was structurally logical. The physical execution was catastrophic. When the union contract expired in the fall of 1979, management demanded mandatory overtime rules and stricter controls over job transfers. The union categorically refused. On November 1, 1979, 35,000 International Harvester workers walked off the job. The turning point of the American agricultural century did not happen in a wheat field. It happened on a picket line. The strike dragged through the bitter winter of 1979 and into the spring of 1980. It lasted nearly 6 months. It remains one of the longest and most destructive labor disputes in American corporate history. For the corporate ledger, the strike was devastating. But for the American agricultural dealer network, it was an unrecoverable betrayal. Spring planting season across the Midwestern Corn Belt is a brutally narrow window dictated entirely by soil temperature and rainfall. A farmer in Indiana cannot wait for a labor dispute in Chicago to resolve before he plants his crop. When the spring of 1980 arrived, the International Harvester Parts pipeline ran completely dry. Dealerships from Ohio to Nebraska found their parts bins empty. If a farmer blew a hydraulic pump on his International 1066 in the middle of April, the local dealer had no replacement to offer. The massive regional distribution centers were paralyzed. Furthermore, there were no new tractors arriving on the rail cars. The dealer lot sat completely empty just as the heavy buying season commenced. The guarantee of mechanical uptime, the sacred covenant that had built the brand since the 1920s, was suddenly shattered. This paralysis triggered Force 1, domestic dealer dominance and competitive displacement. Across the street in almost every rural farm town, the John Deere dealership was fully stocked. Deere's factories in Waterloo, Iowa, were humming. Deere had not suffered a strike. They possessed a formidable new line of iron horse tractors, specifically the legendary 4440 and 4640 models. These green machines featured a highly advanced operator environment, sound guard cab, an integrated rubber-isolated tractor cab that dramatically reduced operator fatigue and isolated the driver from transmission and engine noise. Faced with empty red lots and silent parts counters, thousands of fiercely loyal International Harvester customers made a heartbreaking economic calculation. They could not risk their family farms out of loyalty to a paralyzed corporation. They walked across the street and bought a green tractor. The displacement was swift, permanent, and brutal. John Deere captured massive segments of the high-horsepower row crop market. And once a farmer switched his primary heavy tillage tractor to a new brand, his implements and his future parts, purchases followed. When the strike finally ended in April 1980, the damage was apocalyptic. Industry estimates suggest International Harvester lost roughly $600 million during the work stoppage, approximately $2.2 billion today. They had bled catastrophic amounts of cash, alienated their core customer base, and permanently damaged the strongest dealer network in the United States. When the factory gates in Rock Island finally reopened, International Harvester management made a second fatal miscalculation. Attempting to make up for 6 months of lost production revenue, they ordered the assembly lines to run at absolute maximum capacity. Thousands of new tractors poured out of the plants and were immediately shipped to the dealer network. But the dealers did not have buyers for them. The spring planting window had already closed. The farmers who desperately needed tractors had already purchased John Deere or JI Case machines. The brand new red tractors simply piled up on the dealer lots, unsold and depreciating under the Midwestern summer sun. To finance this massive overproduction, International Harvester relied heavily on short-term corporate borrowing. In a stable national economy, this bridge loan strategy might have allowed the company to survive until the next harvest cycle. But the American economy of 1980 was destabilizing rapidly. The Federal Reserve, battling rampant national inflation, aggressively raised interest rates. The prime lending rate skyrocketed toward 20%. The carrying cost of Harvester's massive short-term debt suddenly doubled, and then tripled. The company was caught in a lethal financial vice. They had borrowed billions of dollars at historically high interest rates to build thousands of tractors that their dealers could not sell. The vast industrial footprint, the foundries, the engine plants, the testing grounds, and the legendary Farmall works transformed overnight from competitive advantages into crushing financial liabilities. The empire was hemorrhaging cash, and the American farm economy was about to plunge into its darkest decade since the Great Depression. Just as International Harvester struggled to absorb the financial shock of its internal labor catastrophe, Force 2, farm credit, and political headwinds hammered the final nail into the corporate coffin. In the early 1980s, the entire American agricultural economy collapsed. It was the worst rural economic depression since the 1930s. During the inflation-heavy 1970s, American farmers had been actively encouraged by the federal government and agricultural lenders to borrow heavily against the rising value of their land to buy more acreage and larger machinery. But in 1980, the United States enacted a grain embargo against the Soviet Union. Crop prices immediately plummeted. Simultaneously, as the Federal Reserve raised interest rates to crush inflation, the cost of servicing those massive farm loans doubled. Land values, the fundamental collateral holding the entire rural economy together, suddenly evaporated. Across the American Corn Belt, farmers simply stopped buying machinery. They could not afford 20% interest rates on a new tractor when their corn was selling below the cost of production. Instead of replacing a worn-out International 1066 with a new model, a farmer would overhaul the engine in his own barn. He repaired the transmission, he welded the broken drawbar. Equipment purchases vanished. In 1979, the total American market for high-horsepower row crop tractors was roughly 130,000 units. By 1983, that number had plummeted to fewer than 60,000. International Harvester possessed no margin for error in a shrinking market. They introduced a brilliantly engineered new line of machines in 1981, the 50 series, featuring advanced transmissions and refined hydraulic systems. But the engineering no longer mattered. The farmers did not have the credit to buy them, and the company did not have the cash to market them. The corporate debt load exceeded $4 billion. To stave off immediate bankruptcy, the executive board initiated a systematic dismantling of the empire. They sold off the construction equipment division to Dresser Industries. They sold the Cub Cadet Lawn and Garden division. They sold the industrial gas turbine business. They liquidated non-essential assets just to make the monthly interest payments on their massive corporate loans. But the deficit was too deep. By the fall of 1984, the agricultural equipment division, the historical soul of the company, was losing hundreds of millions of dollars a year. The banks refused to extend further credit. The end arrived in November. The board of directors signed the agreement with Tenneco. The agricultural division was sold for approximately $430 million. Tenneco already owned J.I. Case, another historic American tractor brand. The plan was not to run the two companies side by side. The plan was absolute consolidation. The retreat was swift and ruthless. Tenneco immediately announced that redundant international harvester factories would be permanently shuttered. The most devastating blow fell on Rock Island, Illinois. The legendary Farmall Works, the enormous, sprawling industrial complex that had birthed the row crop revolution and built over 5 million tractors, was slated for closure. The facility spanned millions of square feet. It employed thousands of multi-generational workers. It was the beating heart of the red tractor empire. On May 14, 1985, the final tractor, an International 5488, rolled off the assembly line at the Farmall plant. There was no celebration. The workers simply attached a small American flag to the cab. Then the consolidation tore through the American countryside. Tenneco aggressively merged the two dealer networks. In hundreds of rural towns where a Case dealer and an international harvester dealer faced each other across a two-lane highway, one contract was abruptly canceled. Multi-generational family businesses were stripped of their signage overnight. Decades of brand loyalty were erased by a corporate ledger. The last shipment arrived. The dealers lost their contracts. The Rock Island gates closed. The assembly lines stopped. The parts shelves emptied. The mechanics moved on. The empire was gone. The name International Harvester was effectively erased from the agricultural market, replaced by the newly formed Case Wine H conglomerate. The remainder of the corporation, focused entirely on commercial trucks and diesel engines, rebranded itself as Navistar International. The new Case IH entity wisely retained the iconic red paint, and they integrated the legendary axial flow combine technology into their global product lines. But the tractors that rolled out of the merged factories were fundamentally different machines. They were hybrids, blending Case transmissions with harvester engines, built under a new corporate philosophy focused on global standardization rather than the proprietary ecosystem that had defined the Farmall era. But the American farmer did not abandon the original machines. Today, the secondary market and preservation community for international harvester equipment is arguably the largest and most fiercely dedicated agricultural heritage movement in the United States. Across the Midwest, at county fairs, threshing bees, and antique tractor pulls, the red machines still dominate. An entire sub-economy of restoration shops, specialty parts manufacturers, and private collectors thrives from Ohio to Nebraska, dedicated solely to keeping the Farmall and international legacy alive. A fully restored, pristine Farmall M or a rare International 1206 can command tens of thousands of dollars at regional estate auctions. The buyers are rarely wealthy investors. They are the sons and grandsons of the men who bought those machines new, paying a premium to reclaim a tangible piece of their family's history. Yet these tractors are not merely museum pieces. A small Farmall H with simple mechanical hydraulics, properly maintained, can still rake hay, run a grain auger, pull a wagon, or clear snow on a family farm. Not for nostalgia. Because the job does not require software, emission sensors, or a six-figure loan. The heavy castings, the simple diesel engines, and the over-engineered transmissions of the muscle tractor era remain fundamentally useful. The physical geography of the empire, however, has largely vanished. If you drive to Rock Island, Illinois today, you will not find the massive Farmall works, the sprawling industrial cathedral that employed thousands and built 5 million tractors was largely demolished in the late 1990s. The land was repurposed for commercial development. The foundries and assembly lines that forged the mechanization of the American prairie are gone, replaced by asphalt and modern logistics centers. There is one quiet, unexpected footnote to the story of International Harvester. In the mid-1930s, when Raymond Loewy designed the Farmall letter series, he also redesigned the company's corporate logo. He created the famous IH symbol, a lowercase I superimposed perfectly over a capital H, intentionally designed to look like a red tractor viewed head-on from the front grille. That logo survived the corporate collapse. It survived the Tenneco buyout. It outlived the Rock Island factory. Today, under the Case IH brand, that specific geometric shape is still stamped onto modern machines, a silent echo of a vanished empire. The tragedy of International Harvester is the tragedy of American industrial scale. The company built machines of undeniable mechanical excellence, designed specifically to outlast the men who bought them. They created a dealer network so intimately tied to the local farm economy that their success and the farmers' success were indistinguishable. But they built an organization so massive, so burdened by debt, and so rigidly structured that it could not survive the very economic cycles it helped agricultural America endure. It is a stark reminder that in the unforgiving landscape of American commerce, a century of brilliant engineering can be erased in 6 months by a broken balance sheet. But the machines remain. Somewhere, in a weathered barn sitting beside a cornfield in Iowa, a 70-year-old Farmall M still idles under the Midwestern sun, still carrying the brilliant red paint on its hood, still waiting for a hand on the throttle and a field that needs turning. See you in the next video.